Click. Alexandre Blanc, Director of Security, adaware. We have Rod Lewis, founder at the OK Network. We have Justin Daniels, General Counsel at Baker Donelson. We have Ron Craig, Head of IT and Cybersecurity for FreePoint Technologies. And we have Alex Sharpe, Principal at Sharpe Management Consulting. It's a pleasure to welcome you. Antoine already has commented superstars on the panel. So, you know, great expectations, great expectations. We've had lots of topics, and some have been high level, some have gone down a bit, some have been a bit out there. You know, what about the world of physical security impacting what you do? In this panel, we want to know how we can prevent this MSS or MSSP becoming the juicy attack vector of choice. Back a few years ago, when we posed multi-tenancy security challenges to the channel community, of course, we were met with a big wall of, no, it can't happen, which, you know, maybe that's true. I don't know. But anyway, Alexandre, let's start with you. Was the MSS and MSP world in the first place ready for COVID-19 from your perspective?
Well, I guess they did start in a good position. Because this is a great need that came out of the COVID stuff. I mean, if we compare companies that were already contracting with a security service provider, they are in better position than the one that did not. Now, something we're going to cover during the panel stuff is about the scope of the contract that is covered by the MSPs and MSSPs with the organization, which may not cover the switch to remote work. I mean, there is a perimeter security thing that was covered with the organization, but then we had the shift to the remote working and homework, and that's triggering a lot of questions that we're going to cover on the panel right there. And I did love how you did introduce us like poking the bear. we are the bad guys, kind of. So yeah, I guess we're going to speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And of course, on this panel, we have a variety of perspectives, including Justin. And Justin, you're a lawyer, you're a legal counsel. Obviously, you've got the context as well. But from your opinion, what's the MSS MSP world ready, and what sort of attack surfaces do you think they've sort of opened up lately?
I think from my perspective, I think the challenge is, I was working on an agreement for a client who was going to change providers and go with an MSSP. And one MSSP got hit, and it, you know, 120 of their clients didn't have access to their networks. So that was an example that was very sobering for that particular client, because that further gave them impetus to change providers. But it also showcased for me that if I'm putting on the hat of the adversary, you know, a common point of failure, because one of the big trends is migration to the cloud. I don't know how you get around the fact that if you're an MSSP that wants to grow and collect more clients, you become a common point of failure. And I saw that in spades when I was working on this transaction, and they went through that whole process, because that gave the client a really good education about, you know, the risk to their business with this outsourced provider. And I know we'll talk about it more with the panelists, but from my perspective, if you're going to do due diligence on an M&A deal, I would probably recommend, if I know they have an MSSP that's providing the target company's network with most of their services, I may want to drill into that a little bit, because that could implode the value of my deal. And so I view it as MSSPs are squarely in the target, because that's how they're going to grow, by more customers, and they're a common point of failure.
All right, common point of failure, and lots of compliance issues. What about you, Ron? What has actually expanded as an attack surface area? Is it about user segmentation, obfuscation of the customer identity? These are some of the topics we talked about in the pre-conference call. What do you think, Ron?
Is that Ron or Rod?
Ron.
Ron, okay. I think you know, with the work from home happening, and we're seeing a lot more of that, you know, in terms of the preparation that I saw, you know, as I was helping clients, you know, I looked at it was like a 50-50. You know, it's like the people that were prepared before COVID came, were able to fare, reasonably well. And then of course, the ones that were kind of playing catch up, because, is it happening? Is it happening? And so to me, it was the work from home situation that kind of really was the driving point, where everybody was kind of distributed. So we always talk about distributed networks. Now we have distributed people. And I think that made everything a lot more cloudy. Can I use that word, cloudy?
Yeah.
You just did.
We are disruptive. That's why we're on the last panel today.
No, well, you're not even on the last panel. No, don't worry.
You're from Canada. You're the friendliest guy on the panel.
So was Alex.
And Rod.
Oh, it's you.
Very good, very good. What about you, Rod? What is it that is particularly vulnerable, or has it always been as vulnerable?
Well, I think when you invited me to be on the panel, it's one of the first things I said. They should be planning for it, right? They should expect that somebody's going to come after them to get after their customers. If you've got a handful of customers, whether it's tens or hundreds, and I can get to you and I can get to 100 or 1,000 customers, then my best point of entry is through you. So you should be planning for it. So from an architecture standpoint, your architecture should be revisited. You talked about obfuscating customer names, etc. You should have IDs, not names. You should make it as hard as possible for when somebody gets into your network to get to your customers. Bastion hosts, all of the above. There shouldn't be free flow from your network to their networks. You really have to tighten up your processes. You have to tighten up your architecture, and you have to be prepared to deal with an intrusion, right? And have all those firewalls, no pun intended, within your organization to protect people from getting to your organization from getting at your customers. And it could also be internal, right? You could have people who you've hired who become disgruntled in some way, shape, or form. You don't want them going unobtruded into your customers' networks either, right? So you protect yourself. You treat everybody as an unknown, right? Even your internals are untrusted, and you architect yourself appropriately. But you should be expecting that you could be used as a point of entry. If you don't, then you've buried your head in the sand, and effectively you're endangering your customers.
But Rod, if I ask you there, what does correct architecting look like? Is it just proper segmentation and multi-tenancy things, or is there something else?
Segmentation, process, need to have access, all of the above, right? So there's a litany of things that you should do. For example, everybody that works in your NOC shouldn't necessarily have unabated access to all of your customers, right? There should be a need to have access. Frankly, you shouldn't have a free flow of network to your customers. You're going to pull stats for whatever reason, and then you're going to do some triage stuff when you need to. But should it always be open so that anybody could get there unfettered? No, it should be metered. You should know who's going into your customers' networks, whether they're good or bad or indifferent, right? So architecture is deep and dark, but just conceptually, you really have to make sure that you've built your internal network properly so that you protect the people you're trying to protect, you're hired to protect in the first place.
Okay, very nice, very nice. Alex,
Yep.
Is this really all about international supply chain security and due diligence, or is that a discussion for another day?
Oh my God, that's a huge question. So if you look at it's a huge question. I'm doing a lot of critical infrastructure work these days, and that's a huge question. What I'd say is everything comes down to economics. Put yourself in the hacker's shoes, right? It's better to have you attack one MSP, you get a lot more stuff than if you go after an organization at a time. So it's kind of like, what was it? Willie Sutton was asked one time, why did he rob banks? He said, that's because where the money is, right? So that's why hackers are going after MSPs. And I think one of the reasons MSPs are being hit right now is because there's just this huge wave with SMBs being attacked post-COVID. And that just happens to be where their infrastructure is. And to everybody's point, and a lot of MSPs out there just weren't ready. They just weren't. And whether you're going to have some that are going to fall prey to creative destruction and Darwinism, and then others are going to get their stuff together and they're going to be the ones who survive, and they'll probably start acquiring the ones who didn't. So we're going to see some consolidation in this space because of it.
Well, Alex, everyone each year always talks about MSP consolidation more from a market standpoint. Oh, it will be a venture capitalist that comes and gobbles up a bunch of MSPs, and they still maintain that sweet spot of service. Are you saying that we'll see the consolidation because some of them haven't handled themselves properly?
This will be a consolidation for a different reason. We're talking about how some of the outsourced, more than just MSP, but the hosting providers, their business models had changed over time. They never reached scale to, get the economies they needed. Now we're talking about ones that are going to go out of business because they're going to lose their clients for reasons like this, or their funding disappears or whatever. This is just going to be because of a fundamental weakness in their it's because of structural problems. You're going to see them just disappear.
And these structural problems, is that the same thing you're imagining? Like Rod said, they haven't architected themselves in a secure way.
I think that's one of the problems. That's the part of it. Part of it's what Rod was saying is more on the technical side, and what Justin brought up was on the legal side. My experience dealing with a lot of MSPs is they're less sophisticated in this space than like a Fortune 500 company. So they miss the pieces. Maybe they spend time with Justin putting the legal documents in place. Maybe they spend time with an insurance company, get the right insurance policies in place, but they don't architect the physical infrastructure, or they don't have incident response planning. There's usually, in my experience with MSPs, because they don't have the same history, they don't have the same resources, they don't hit all of, it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole, right? They hit what's in front of them and they miss something. Now it's going to just take some of them out.
All right. Well, some of them will be taken out. Let's talk through that, Alexandre. Obviously, maybe you can't, reveal too much, but how would some of them be taken out?
Well, I want to first get back to what has been said before, because Justin spoke about the M&A issue and the due diligence work needed when you do an acquisition, but that was from a customer standpoint. But as Alex Sharpe just said, if there is M&A on the service provider acquisition, what's can happen to the customer agreement and where is your asset being transferred? So you had a question about the international stuff as well. What if it's a foreign company buying, the company? Then what is going to be your liability on that side of things? That's one of the key points. And also, I think Justin did spot out about the fact that the MSSP can be a single point of failure as well. This is from a data standpoint, and that's your, the IP, intellectual property capital, when the organization fully rely on the service provider, including the backups. I've seen this morning, Brian Stoner, no, actually it was Eric Cron, one of the two, that spoke about one of the service provider that got hit by a ransomware. And actually the whole backup infrastructure was just in the end of the service provider, and the customer organization didn't have question before if they had redundancy and stuff like that. So basically the big hit on the service provider did destroy the whole asset of the customer themselves. So there is despite the fact that you transfer the risk to a provider, there is still a due care and due diligence process that you have to achieve as a customer, and most likely making sure that you have some redundancy in your assets, because blindly trusting a third-party source is exposing you to one of the big threats on that stuff. So this is the point I didn't want to raise. I don't know what was your question, if you want to get back to this one.
Yeah, no, I like it. I like it. I was just curious then, could you paint a picture in maybe not so instructive terms, but how would people try and take out these MSPs?
Oh, I mean, this is the regular threat attacks. I mean, sending payload to each, this is easy. I mean, you do some reconnaissance, you get your data about MSP, target employees, spear phishing, targeted attacks. And as Rod was saying, if they did not have the needed access restriction and the network isolation, and you get one of the employees only, it can spread to the whole network and you can pull out all the data. So that's one of the attack vector, but it's going to be like social engineering, viruses, attack on the infrastructure as well. Also, sometimes, because MSSP usually rely on cloud storage, and this is all cloud backend. So we trust them to secure the infrastructure. And as they grow, one of the main challenges is to actually maintain the security posture of the infrastructure as well, both from the customer standpoint, as the service provider is the customer of the cloud provider. So they have to adjust to the evolution of the cloud stack. So the cloud become also a threat on that side. And there is also something that people forget on the due diligence process is that when you are a customer of a cloud provider, all the risk and the contract that actually bind you with the cloud provider is actually transferred to the final customer. So, and this is something that we obviously, I guess Justin will back this up, but if your service provider use, let's say, Amazon Web Service or one other, the terms and conditions of that provider apply to your data, then fall back on you. And that should be transparent from the MSSP to you as a final customer. So you do not escape the fact that you have to do the due diligence on the legal standpoint and review all the liability between the whole third providers. And it's becoming even more complicated if the MSSP do a good job at diversity of resource and they spread the whole storage across multiple cloud providers. Because then you have to, consolidate all the agreements and make sure that this is matching the requirement. And this is from a due diligence standpoint, but it can be also from a compliance standpoint, because a lot of providers must be compliant. And we saw that California just passed a privacy bill. So that's also a threat on the compliance of the end user customer. What happens if the service provider is not in California and the customer has data for California? Will they take care of that stuff? So this is all kind of question that has to be reviewed on a continual basis.
Well, that's nice, because that brings us on to that liability and contractual question. Justin, what is working from home actually done there? Surely it's created a lot of headaches.
I think the first thing that it's done is the security perimeter for most companies now is the router and many times the personal device of the employee. And those are two assets that the company doesn't own, but can significantly impact the company. And then in the same vein, most companies aren't reviewing their cyber insurance to see if the definition in their insurance covers non-company owned devices. And in many policies, it doesn't. And then when they have the incident and they go and ask, for the coverage letter, that's when there's silence, because that's when they're told, oh, sorry, that breach emanated from your personal device of your employee, and that's not covered under the insurance policy. But I think given what Alex was talking about and Alexander, let me kind of clarify the contract part. So I just did 2 webinars today talking about M&A and cyber risk and third-party supply chain. But here's the thing. Most companies now do not want to build their own internal security team. They want to use MSSPs, the whole reason why the business is growing so much. So what then becomes a key contract for the customer is that MSSP contract. And an MSSP is going to basically want to limit their liability, even for a breach. It has to be gross negligence. They're going to strap insurance on top of all of that. And I think what you're going to start to see is clients, and not just the ones that I represent, because they asked me to do this, is clients are going to become more sophisticated because they're going to realize that MSSP is a common point of failure. So I would expect to see bigger companies with leverage, middle market, who are saying, look, I'm outsourcing to you. You are a potential, could destroy my business. To me, ransomware is the worst. That's the one that you talk to any CEO, that gets their attention, because you're literally not transacting business. Wire fraud is a bad day at the office. Ransomware gets people fired. And my point is, I think as an MSSP, you better be expecting clients now to push harder on the terms, because at the end of the day, they may not be able to control what happened to you, but they're going to expect that you make good on it. So I expect to see a lot more rigorous negotiation of that, and possibly looking into the kind of insurance for the reasons that I just stated to all of you. And I also see it in other agreements. Like if you want to do business with a Fortune 500 company, you'll sign a security addendum, and they'll have strict prohibitions about where you can store and transfer your data. They might let you use Amazon Web But good luck, you're not negotiating terms with AWS. You're getting their standard agreement. You don't get to negotiate. And understanding all these parts of the puzzle is how you then, as a MSSP, understand what's coming and what you have to do, because it'll stem partly from your legal obligation. But even if you're not legally liable, if an MSSP gets hit, what's that going to do to your business reputation, which you can't put a value on? And then from the other standpoint, if I'm representing the people who want to use MSSPs, now I have to think through, where's my data going? If it goes over to Europe, I've got Schrems 2 or coming from Europe. I've got GDPR. Now, if I do business in California, I have CCPA, because I think what may start to drive a lot of the security issues are GDPR and CCPA and the other states. But I want to make a last point to everyone is, think about what all the state regulation does to our economy about innovation. I think it stifles it, which is why if you're going to regulate this stuff, you've got to look at the federal level like they did in Europe. Otherwise, you have 52 breach notification laws.
Yep.
Think of the cost of complying with all that. I've done it. It's insane. If you don't have insurance for that, unless you're Home Depot, you're done. And the C-suite, and I'm going to finish because I'm taking up a lot of time, you have a gap between what they say is important because they know they need to say it, but when you actually watch what they do, there's a gap. And that all filters into this conversation we're having today about MSSPs and customers in the future. Thank you, panelists, for bearing with my soliloquy.
No, it's great.
Yeah, so Justin's absolutely right about the regulatory issues, but the feds aren't going to solve it. That's a topic for another day, but we're not going to see a federal resolution to that. The courts and the legislature have sidestepped that one for a lot of reasons for many years. It's not going to happen anytime soon.
Wow.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a whole other topic, but yeah, there's lots of big money tied up with private data that doesn't want to let go of it, but that's a whole other topic.
And we also have a constitutional problem as well, because there's an argument about who actually has, who can actually impose those laws and enforce them. I think the more interesting thing is California and other states claim that it doesn't matter if the server or the incident happened in their state. If it's a citizen of that state, no matter where they're located, it applies. I think that's going to be the more interesting question.
GDPR is the same thing with the EU resident. It's their data regardless of where it is. I would say this, Alex, for the benefit of the audience. It does bear watching what happens with the DOJ lawsuit against Google.
Oh, absolutely.
Because that's the one thing the feds have over the tech companies is the staying power to litigate for years despite all the resources the tech companies have.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that they're not using the privacy issues or the data regulation issues to go after Google. But this is that's all about monopoly power.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting. But that again is another topic, and we can look at it. What's going on against Google is very different than Amazon, Facebook, Twitter. You can go right down the list. It's a very interesting topic, and maybe that's a panel for another day that somebody would like to host.
It's kind of tied because it funnels the private data, but yes, whole other deal. I think the one thing that we haven't talked about, and I'll jump in, is, and we kind of touched on it, is when people start working from home and a lot of them are using their own devices, et cetera, it's the PII beyond the corporate use that's on that device. So how do I, as an MSP or anybody, triage an issue on somebody's private device that also has the fact that they were purchasing stuff at, I don't know, a laundry shop or whatever, they're doing other stuff that's private to them, but they're using that device also for work purposes, and something unforeseen happens, right? So it's all those kind of permutations and combinations that started to come together when people were forced to work from home and corporations weren't ready for it. Just cause more and more problems for MSPs. Because if I'm storing some of that, if I happen to get some of that data, can I really hold on to it? It's partly the customers, it's partly the companies. Where does it reside? And I don't think anybody was ready for any of that stuff. And so it's the whole thing is pardon my words, a dog's breakfast in some ways. And I don't think anybody was really prepared for it except for those companies that already had users working from home consistently.
But Rod, isn't what you're really saying, and this applies to the MSSPs and how they have to think about it, is the reason why the tech companies are some of the richest companies in the human history are because their greatest asset is data. But now we live in an environment where that data is not only an asset, but also potentially a significant liability. And so now when I'm an MSSP, I really need to start thinking, as well as my customers, what data do I want access to? Because it might be important to have it, but if I don't secure it and keep it confidential, now I have all of this risk that is associated with it. And I think by and large companies have only looked at data as only being an asset. But what you're really saying is you need to start paying attention that data is like everything else. It can be an asset, but it's so important. It's also a potential liability. And that has to inform the thinking of MSSPs and their customers when you're creating these architectures, because they're there to allow data to flow through it.
Correct. You know, Justin, that's an interesting point, because the moment we figured out how to monetize that data, we let the genie out of the bottle.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it's not going back in. We're not going to, we can't unring that bell.
And just think about it, right? It flows all the way through to your processes. So I'm part of the, I fall under GPDR, and I say to you as an MSSP, I want everything that you have on me to disappear. Well, you don't have processes for your backups. You don't even know where the data is. Now what?
Well, how does that go into the retention required, right? By the regulators, the state laws, yes, the federal laws, the industry you're in. I had to deal with that with one of my clients, and I'm going to keep the name out of it, but their legal counsel eventually decided that the fines on they had to violate one of two things, and they decided which one was the bigger hammer. So
Alex, what you're really talking about is the Pinto decision, as I like to call it. We all remember in the U.S. the Pinto. They decided it was easier to pay out the lawsuits and the people who passed away than to fix it, which to me is no different than all the high-tech flying tech companies who, you know what, security, privacy, that's an afterthought. We go get market share and we have to deal with security and privacy. It's just the cost of doing business at that point. It's just the exact same issue.
Well, I've been around long enough, because I remember those discussions with the banks talking about fraud and anti-money laundering and all this, you know, before cybersecurity was called cybersecurity, and they'd be like, it's cost of doing business. I got insurance to cover it.
And it's also reflected in the fines we've seen with some of these big companies, right? They're making billions of dollars in revenue and they get $1 million fine. It's a speeding ticket. So it doesn't really matter.
Guys, we are sort of out of time, but I'd like to give Ron the final word. Ron, what should we be thinking about?
Oh, I'm still here, by the way. Yeah, that was fantastic, guys. Actually, I really enjoyed that. That was actually fantastic. I was almost going to get Alexandre to move out of the way so I could look down at Justin and go, "Don't forget, we're here."
Hey, let's agree to back up at 5 with a glass of wine or some bourbon.
But I like to come back to the, I hear that we're always talking about single point of failure, and I always look at it, as also a single point of investment when it comes to MSP. The fact is that, you've got 100 devices and you got 100 clients, you got 100 times 100. And I look at that as actually a possible entry point in an MSP. We look at that, the MSP is basically the root node, and those arms spread out and they're like a little spider and they go out, and all you have to do is get through one of those nodes at one of those clients. And then you get into the MSP, and then you can branch out from there. So it's not even a question of getting into the MSP directly. It's it's indirectly that you have to worry about. So it's 100 times 100 is the potential points of failure. So it's not really a single point of failure. It's 100 times whatever. There's actually a formula that I would say that we have to be cognizant of. And again, to me, it's always about the single point of investment. ROI. What is going to net me the biggest? These criminals. I mean, they run businesses. As sad as that sounds, I mean, we see stories where they have HR departments and they have lunchrooms and they have. It just makes you sick that they actually think they're running. I don't know, they're delusional or they're criminals. But we see that happening, and of course they're going to try to maximize their processes, their KPIs. They want to steal effectively. And an MSP and an MSSP is a beautiful target for maximizing your ROI or investment.
Well said.
Wow. Well, this has been a tour de force. We did poke the bear. Hopefully, that was the intention. You know, yeah, poke. We got nice comments in the audience. It's perfect. But we are now out of time. So I know I'm going to see you again with Sandor on one of his ventures or your ventures to make the world a safer place. But yeah, we are out of time. Alex, Rod, Ron, Justin, and Alexandre, thank you for being such great sports. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you in the audience and seeing you again soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Feel free to reach out.
Will do. See you soon. Perfect. Lovely. Okay. So yes, lovely comments. Please keep them coming. Somebody again asked me about the merch link, which I will put at the end. It's inside the chat if you scroll up, so don't worry about that. Now today, of course, we have looked at the physical side of security. We've looked at the cyber side. We've looked at the channel side. And in a way, when we're looking at the MSS of